Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our Hybrid Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Summit, brought to you by AvePoint and Zerto. The editorial staff of redmondmag.com, Virtualization Cloud and Review, and AWSinsider.net have worked hard to bring you together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know the event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You will receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you. During today's third session, we will be giving away a Surface Pro A, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, AvePoint and Zerto, available on the console right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of AvePoint and Zerto's underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Top Infrastructure Tips for Hybrid Cloud Backup and Disaster Recovery Data. This session features Joey Gattoni, Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. Joey is recognized as a VMware vExpert and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and has over 20 years of experience working in both Fortune 500 and smaller firms. He has worked extensively on database platforms and cloud technologies and has specific expertise in performance tuning, infrastructure, and disaster recovery. Take it away, Joey.
Thanks, Chris. Just to make sure everybody can see the slides okay, we're on the title slide. I'm still getting like a push to audience button here.
Looks good on my end.
All right, thanks.
I think you're good to go.
Thanks. Sounds good. Hey, everybody, welcome in and greetings. And this is Top Infrastructure Tips for Hybrid Cloud Backup and Disaster Recovery Data. There's a lot of interesting scenarios that I kind of wanted to discuss in today's talk, and I think really neat because one of the things the cloud gives us is a lot of flexibility and cost control and how we can do disaster recovery. And that's something that I think not everybody always thinks about when they think about cloud. You know, a lot of people think of just purely migrations or those sorts of things, but there are a lot of different ways that we can take advantage of the flexibility of the cloud, because frankly, despite anything anybody else tells you about why they're using the cloud, the big thing you're using the cloud for is flexibility. You have the flexibility to have a lot of storage. You have the flexibility to have maybe a disaster recovery side. It's funny, I've been talking about disaster recovery for probably 15 or 20 years now. And one of the things I always used to ask people, even in large corporations, how many data centers does your corporation have? And I know when I worked at Comcast, we had 3 or 4, and we were kind of an outlier there. A lot of organizations, have one data center or one colo that might have partnerships with others, but they'd have a lot of lead time on getting hardware in the event of a disaster. And through vendor tools and just having cloud support, there's a lot of neat stuff out there. Just a quick image, there's me. I do data stuff, basically. But let's talk more about DR. And the first thing I always like to discuss with people is, do you have a plan? Do you have a disaster recovery plan? And this kind of includes business continuity planning as well. I had the fortune, I guess I would say, of growing up in New Orleans, which is an area that is quite prone to hurricanes. And then for the next about 10 years of my career, I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is an area right on the edge of hurricane zones. And I also managed some manufacturing plants in Puerto Rico. So my disaster recovery planning experience is pretty vast. And back in the bad old days, it was really hard. We used to pay a vendor. So our disaster recovery plan was effectively take backups, ship them off site, and we would pay a vendor to rent hardware or to effectively have hardware on standby for us. We got to test with that vendor once a year. We would go to their location, which was in New Jersey or Philadelphia, and test with their hardware once a year. This was kind of pre-virtualization being really big, so it was a pretty ugly process of standing up a bunch of operating system environments on physical hardware, installing media, and then installing backup tapes. So not a super fun process. Things are a lot different now. One of the things that technically helped us a lot was when everything went virtual, and that leads into the cloud where everything is virtual and everything is defined by an API. All of this being said, we have a lot of technical options for what we want to do. The big thing, though, is to have a business-focused disaster recovery plan, and this doesn't just mean your IT systems. Of course, you want to work to establish things like email and instant message. Hopefully, you're using a software as a service provider for that, so you're somewhat protected from DR in those scenarios. But you want to be able to think about those well in advance and kind of have it understand that. But your business needs to sign off on what your DR plan is, and I'm gonna tell you this is a little bit challenging, and we're going to talk about some things and help you kind of understand how to build one of those plans. So for today's agenda, we're going to talk about the business needs for disaster recovery. I just kind of led into that. This really boils down to two specific kind of statistic terms we like to talk about in DR, and that's recovery point objective and recovery time objective. And those are just terms we use to define how much data you can lose and how long your business can be down. This is going to vary depending on the nature of your business. We have a number of differences based on the type of business you are. If your business is manufacturing and you mainly manufacture 9 to 5, that's going to be a very straightforward disaster recovery process compared to, say, somebody who's operating 24/7 and is an e-commerce site that's immediately going to losing money if things are down. So this is really a business continuity plan. If we start going formal, there are some minor differences between what we want to talk about in business continuity versus disaster recovery. But in a lot of ways, they're the same thing. You also need to think about beyond your infrastructure. So this is absolutely not an IT exercise. And as an IT professional who's kind of highly focused on infrastructure, this is probably something I've been guilty of a lot in my career, where we build out these like elaborate high availability and disaster recovery solutions using, storage replication and database replication and all these cool things where we can have like 2 or 3 layers of our application up. But we don't really plan for how we're going to make the DNS change for the website if we have to move it to another data center, which kind of leads me to my next point. Disaster recovery planning without testing is a disaster. One of the things that would always frustrate me infinitely when I worked at Comcast is we had a tertiary data center. Okay. And I see Victoria saying she can't see my slide. Hang on. Okay, cool. So we're back on this agenda slide. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah. So with disaster recovery in mind, that's something that's a concern. So make sure you have the ability to test. Make sure you have the ability to test frequently, because if you don't understand the impact of the changes that are going to happen, and typically this is going to be network related, and this is also one of the things cloud really enables for us, is the ability to do those changes. And then finally, backups. Backups are by far the most important part of your environment in terms of data protection. The biggest, although the slide I tried to show you before that I'll show you again, the disaster slide here, is definitely an example of that's from a hurricane. But the biggest disaster that most organizations face now is a ransomware attack, right? So that's going to be the most common scenario that organizations are going to see. All right, so let's talk about hybrid cloud. So there are a lot of architectures in hybrid cloud deployments. There, depending on who you talk to and which CIO you talk to, there are a lot of ways you can define this. So this can be, in some cases, some people will say if they're using Office 365 or Google Suite for email, they're going to call that Office 365, or hybrid cloud, rather, sorry. Because, there are emails now on the cloud, even though maybe the rest of their computers are in the data center. There really is no right or wrong answer here. The general idea is that you have some resources in your data center or co-location facility if you're not hosting your own data center, and some either in the public cloud or maybe in a private cloud environment. If you ever talk to anybody from Microsoft or AWS, they'll be honest with you and tell you any organization of any size is going to effectively be a hybrid cloud, because you're never, especially a large organization, never going to get rid of all of their on-prem resources, no matter how hard they try, and things kind of evolve and move over time. The general idea, though, and where this gets kind of specific, is there are some dedicated hybrid cloud environments, and it's important to kind of understand how those work and maybe how those interact in a DR scenario, because they might work a little bit differently than if you're just using, say, VMware VMs or Hyper-V VMs, or I guess Broadcom VMs, I should say, after last week. But if you're using something like Azure Stack or AWS Outpost, those compute resources, and those are kind of, I hate to use the term true hybrid cloud, but those are AWS Outpost and Azure Stack are things that emulate the infrastructure that's running in AWS and Azure respectively. So the machines you're running are going to feel like just like your Azure or AWS experience, or at least a lot closer. So if you talk to the cloud vendors' sales teams, that is what they will call hybrid cloud, not necessarily the whole story there. But the last part of hybrid cloud that they always want to talk about is really, and this goes back to that whole thing about infrastructure, it's important to understand your network and authentication options in both locations. It's the most challenging parts of this model. So making sure you have a VPN in place. And when we talk about DR and how it's going to work in public cloud or in hybrid cloud models a little bit later, one of the things that you want to think about is like how that network's going to look and what that VPN connection is going to be. Because as you move to maybe more real-time DR solutions, you're going to need a lot of bandwidth. One of the most common ways that you'll see organizations do hybrid DR is to have some kind of replication of their virtualization, and they will in turn do that, and then you'll see you'll need bandwidth because all the changes from all over your VMs is going to get replicated. So let's talk about cloud and the DR, because I think, or cloud and DR, I should say, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic. Sorry about that. But one of the things that I always run into that I think the cloud is really kind of beneficial in terms of DR testing is something I run into just in my day-to-day work is kind of helping customers with database solutions. One of the things we always tell customers about database backups, and this applies to any backup, not just database backups, is that without a successful restore operation, so if you haven't restored a database backup or a system backup, you don't really know if your backup's good. I mean, sure, the backup completed successfully and without errors, but I know, for example, many database systems will happily back up corrupt database pages, and you won't discover it until you go to either restore them or do operations against those pages. And one of the challenges organizations traditionally have had with doing this, especially people who weren't buying the infrastructure, was just getting the storage or compute resources that were associated with those with those to do those restores. Because if you think about it, even in the virtual world, you're typically, a lot of organizations are limited on the number of compute nodes they have available. Storage is always a challenge. So like getting enough storage, especially in large database backups where you might need, multiple terabytes of storage to do a DR test, that's something that's gonna be a challenge. So that kind of goes away in the cloud. We have, pretty much all the storage we can consume, and we'll talk about what that means and how that impacts your disaster recovery planning later in the session. But especially for a one-off DR test, you do effectively have all the storage that's needed. The other aspect of this that can be a challenge, and there are some tools that have done this on-prem that let you do it, but is the impact of testing to your network. Whenever you're doing a DR test, without a lot of work, all your machines are going to come up as the same IPs that they were in their source configuration, right? So same IP addresses. If that happens, if you haven't sufficiently isolated your network, you're going to potentially have major IP conflicts. So that's something else that makes another challenge to test, is that you typically have to create some sort of bubble network. And if you're using a tool like VMware Site Recovery Manager, that does give you the option to do that. But if you don't have a tool like that, you're kind of on your own to try to build out that segmentation, which is possible, and it's definitely doable, but it's not easy. And the downside ramifications are you can take down your network, so that's always a little bit scary. But what the cloud does buy you for this DR testing bit is flexibility and isolation. And so you have all that storage that you could possibly need. You have an isolated network environment. And this can be hard to acquire in those on-prem architectures, or even, if you're in a colo, where the colo may have limited hardware that you have access to, or if you're working through an MSP. MSPs typically run pretty tight on hardware, and they're going to nail you for a lot if you try to have additional nodes for disaster recovery. So the other thing to think about is the cloud gets you additional regional coverage. So one of to me, the great benefits of the cloud is the public cloud is that Microsoft, Amazon, and Google all have data centers all over the world. This means you can put resources closer to customers if you're an international company, but it also means you can try to isolate some of your resources from natural disasters. Like I mentioned, I grew up in New Orleans. My first real computer job was an internship at the utility company in New Orleans, and our data center was on the third floor of a building that was on the other side of the Mississippi River, the one that's above sea level, by several feet. Or a couple of meters if anybody is not from the U.S. And so it was theoretically protected from flooding, but we also had major power concerns because hurricanes hit there. So we had like this satellite connection, it was the 90s, to another data center in Jackson, Mississippi, which was really, really janky in terms of like how we got data there, and replication was also in its infancy, so it was a real challenge to have data protection that way. Now I can simply spin up cloud resources in regions all over the U.S. I happen to be in Europe delivering this presentation this evening. There are multiple data centers here where I can spin things up, all that sorts of things. The one thing we want to think about there, and this is less so if you're in a hybrid cloud model and kind of more so if you're just in a full public cloud model, is not all resource types are necessarily available in all cloud regions. And I'll give you an example. I have an Azure customer who has very, very large database servers. Their database servers have 1.7 terabytes of RAM. Potentially could have up to 128 CPUs. They don't because of licensing reasons. But typically, Microsoft would recommend they choose a region. I think because of their base region, Microsoft would recommend they choose North Central U.S. They can't do disaster recovery to North Central U.S. because currently the VMs they need aren't available there. So you want to do some planning and investigation into what's available with your cloud regions. The other thing, and I read an article in Redmond several months back when Amazon had a pretty major outage. The other thing you want to understand, and this is very hard to always get a clear answer on, that you want to know if that there's cloud services that are single homed. And generally speaking, VMs are pretty robust in terms of their uptime because VMs are what we call a service primitive, so they're one of the first things the cloud providers buy, and they kind of run at the lowest level of the stack. So if VMs are failing, everything else is down. But in some cases, there are some services that you may have dependencies on, like maybe a monitoring service or even a cloud networking service that can be single home to a cloud region, like Amazon ECUS 1A, which seems to be the one that frequently goes down. And you can kind of get trapped. So you want to think carefully and understand what your risk profile is for the cloud. So the next topic here is RPO and RTO. And I mentioned this earlier, and this is totally a business decision. So this is how much data you can lose without having any impact to your business, the recovery point objective. The easiest way I can describe this is to describe it in database backups, right? In database backups, we back up the database typically once a week, which is a full copy of the database, and we'll back up the differential changes typically once a day. But every 5 to 15 minutes, or maybe even less than that on some systems, we're backing up the transaction log or the redo logs if you're an Oracle. And that delta of data is what our recovery point objective is. So if we have 15-minute log backups and we're adequately protecting the backups, and we know we can always get to the backups, you can safely say we can restore our database back to a point in time of 15 minutes or 5 minutes. You kind of want to think that way about your whole system environment. I will say this has a very strong bias towards stateful systems. So anything that's storing data, it's really important to understand that. It's probably less important to worry about things like app servers or web servers because typically those have code that are pushed to them and they can just be recreated. But anything that's actually capturing your business data is where that recovery point objective really matters. Recovery time objective, on the other hand, and it's not recovery time object, sorry, small typo on my slide there. This is how long your systems can be down with without major business impact. This is a financial decision, so and I'll get to this later in the slide. But how long in which your impact, and that's going to determine the investment you make in your systems. A good example of this tied to AWS is Amazon.com. So if Amazon.com is down for any moments of time, Amazon is going to quickly start losing massive amounts of income. So they design Amazon.com to have effectively as many nines, which is the way we describe of it uptime, in 99.999%. Amazon designs Amazon.com to have as much uptime as basically possible because of that impact. If you're selling 2 or 3 items a day, your recovery time objective is probably a little bit lower than Amazon's. And you may ask, why does this matter? But these are the 2 elements of a business decision that let you plan your backup and DR strategy. You should design your architecture for disaster recovery and frankly, high availability as well after the business makes a decision on what the RTO and RPO should be. And what's going to happen if you're new at this or you haven't done an exercise like this with your business is your business leadership is going to say, we can't lose any data and we can't be down for more than 30 seconds at a time. That's pretty much our requirements. Your job as a technology professional is to go back after that, design an architecture that ensures that they can't lose any data and that they won't be down more than 5 minutes. And after you show the bottom line number to your management, and they faint, then they'll be like, actually, we can probably lose about an hour of data, and we can be down for 5 or 6 hours without major impact. That's typically how this works. The business is going to ask for everything until they actually see the cost. So have a good understanding of that, and you'll do well with this. It's something I know I've been through this with a number of clients, and typically you'll have like a CEO type or a director type who doesn't really understand what things cost to deliver that degree of uptime, and then they'll kind of run with that. So one of the places we see organizations try to save money and reduce their overall technology costs is to reduce redundancy. And this can come in a number of fashions. So this can come into running your virtual environments hotter. So you're packing more workload in fewer nodes. It can also come by getting rid of high availability and disaster recovery options. So why do we have a secondary node? Those secondary nodes are never going to be, aren't being used. And this DR thing's costing me $25 a VM a month, and we have 100 VMs, and that adds up a lot. And this is absolutely a business decision, and it's well within the rights of the business to make it. However, especially when we talk about disaster recovery and backups and things like that, ransomware is really a big thing. We're not even really a ransomware specific shop, and we've run into a number of customers that have been hit with ransomware attacks. I mean, we've probably had 10 in the last year, and like I say, it's not something that we really specialize in. So I think if you're trying to reduce costs, you might want to look at maybe reducing your HA, especially if your recovery time objective isn't that high. But I would really try to shy away from reducing any DR spend. That would be my last holdout, because you want to have the ability to revert back to something. And especially the modern DR tools offer you a good deal of protection around ransomware by doing things like storing backups offline and having additional protections that you might not otherwise have. So let's talk about using the cloud for DR. This is something I have kind of been I started working with Microsoft, with Azure and AWS pretty early days. So I can pretty much safely say I have about 10 plus years of cloud experience now. I know for sure I've been working on it for 10 years, and it took about 2 years for the cloud to actually start working, so hence the 10 plus. But one of the interesting things about cloud is a single vendor relationship allows you to have a vast geo presence. And yes, there are data center vendors out there, like Equinix is probably the main one I've worked with, that have a lot of resources that you can put anywhere in the world. However, what those guys don't have that AWS, GCP, and Azure have is a fairly straightforward software-defined networking solution. Not that cloud networking is super easy, but it is relatively easy to define and learn. So you can kind of get started, and you can get started with DR really easy. You just kind of need a VPN and then a network there to land in. The big thing you're paying for here is flexibility. You have a lot of options around compute and storage capacity that's just waiting on you. And if you're just using the cloud for DR, this can be really cost effective, because we're going to talk about a couple of patterns later in the deck, and actually in 2 slides that are most common. And some of the more common patterns are really cheap and just store your backups there. But if you're using a backup or disaster recovery service, it's a little bit more costly, but your stuff is waiting for you. So you have lots of options there. So it can be a lot cheaper and more effective than doing anything else for DR, and you have the ability to test. So it's important to understand your options in a cloud DR scenario. And a lot of folks will talk about multi-cloud, and I've talked about multi-cloud, and I've mostly talked about multi-cloud kind of negatively. I didn't think it's a terrible thing. There are large organizations that do it. it's really, really difficult to build stateful systems that can easily fail over across multiple clouds. To be honest, it's not trivial to build systems that can fail across cloud regions within a single provider. So multi-cloud makes that extremely difficult. So if you're just getting started with this, don't even try to think about that, in my opinion. One of the big challenges there is that you have to really understand the security and networking stack in each cloud. And your resources that are your IT folks that are working on this have only going to have worked with either one cloud, or you've provided training for them on a cloud. So that's another important thing to understand. I kind of strongly recommend, I have business relationships with Microsoft and Amazon, and Google is also somebody I've worked with. They're all fine. They each have their pluses and minuses. I don't think you can really go wrong picking any of them, and the prices aren't dramatically different in any way. We've had some edge cases, but I think trying to do VR hybrid multi-cloud is a little bit crazy. One of the things you want to understand is what your backup model looks like, especially if you're in a hybrid world where you have some resources on-prem. Are you backing up straight to the cloud? In which case, like, your entire DR strategy or even, restore strategy might be around going into cloud. Or what a lot of folks will want to do, and this to me is also a good idea, especially if you have a low recovery point objective, is to have local backups available, and then those get replicated to the cloud in some fashion. If your backups are in the cloud, you have a variety of options of what you can do. It's just going to take longer to get those backups back down to on-prem. But if your whole plan is we're going to do DR in the cloud, then that's definitely a way to go. And we see that with a number of organizations where they might extend their network into a cloud provider using a VPN gateway, so that the cloud just becomes an extension of their data center. And some of these choices may be dependent on who your cloud vendor is and who your backup vendor is, in terms of how their backup solution works with the various cloud platforms, because each of the vendors and then each of the backup vendors kind of have nuances between them. There are some advantages to using a cloud backup solution. I think that the biggest advantage is kind of cost, because, and this kind of ties to my third bullet here, especially. So I a little bit of my personal history. I worked for a medical device company that shall not be named, but my LinkedIn profile is public. And they were kind of terrible. There was a big article that was written about them in the business press about how they ran an illegal clinical trial and accidentally killed some people. Accidentally. So they never got approval for the clinical trial. Some people died. It was bad, as you can imagine. As you can also imagine, the Food and Drug Administration was really, really unhappy with us for running said illegal clinical trial. What that meant for me in IT, aside from having egg on my face for working for a crappy company, was that we had to back up everything. And not only do we have to back up everything, we had to keep it forever. And this was in around 2009, 2010 timeframe. So it was before, I think, cloud was like AWS S3 might have existed, but it wasn't something we could easily switch to for storing backups, especially in that organization, which didn't have a lot of IT maturity. But now, if I had to do the same thing, I would back that up to a service like AWS Glacier or Azure Archive Storage, and I would be paying a penny a gig a month on those things, because typically we never had to reuse those backups, and that's where those tiering things get you pretty good. It's really cheap to write to them. It's really expensive to read to them. So if you have a government agency who's making you keep backups, that's probably by far the biggest advantage of the cloud for backup. But you have a lot of options in the cloud with backup. You have a lot of options on-prem with backup. There are a lot of vendors in this space. In the cloud, you can work with both native solutions from Microsoft or Amazon or Google, or you can use third-party solutions. And the third-party solutions may be good for you if you're more comfortable with those solutions and you've worked with them in the past. The one thing you really kind of want to understand there is if you're working with a third-party solution, is how does it integrate with your cloud provider? How does it integrate with their timelines? One of the cool things most of the providers do is I talked about, backing up to an archival tier, but they also have the ability to like smart tiers. So, right, you might back up to hot, keep your backups in hot for a month, and then move them to a cool tier, and then ultimately move them to an archive tier, and then ultimately delete them. That's a really nifty feature. There's also long-term retention where you can kind of keep a monthly, yearly, and weekly backup as your regulatory requirements are needed. Everybody in the cloud, I feel like, has all the cloud providers have made big investments in the backup space there. And then once you're in the cloud, you may want to think differently about backups. Like one of the kind of things I always tell folks is that, like with database servers, and this is something that's kind of specific to SQL Server, but SQL Server supports backing up directly to Azure Cloud Storage, and actually in the new version, it supports backing up directly to S3 and Amazon. If you're backing up your databases there, and you can use a template from a VM template to build a new VM very quickly, why back up the entire server? Just back up the databases, and then if you have a failure, you can simply spin up a new server and start restoring databases to it. So just an idea. It's not something that works for every server, every company, but you do want to think once that's in the cloud about how to do that. So let's talk about the basic strategies of Cloud DR. This is a slide I always like to share with customers because I think it's pretty realistic. And this is going to depend on the number of IT people you have and the number of maybe how good at automation you are as well in terms of at least for this first one. So the basic strategies around Cloud DR that I have and this kind of goes in order of pricing. So strategy one is just to ship your backups to cloud storage. And this can kind of go into any form. And these are very loosely defined, but it's something to keep in mind. This would just be shipping those backups there with the plan that if we lost our primary site, we would start building VMs in the cloud and restoring them, or restoring these backups as VMs, either way. This is very cheap. You're only paying for the storage required for the backup. There's no compute associated with this. I loosely say 48 to 96 hours, and that's assuming you have a full set of current backups. Honestly, this could take more than that. It could take less than that if your team's built a lot of automation. But it's really cheap. So that's the benefit. So it could take a while, high degree of variability. But it's going to be really cost effective. Two, taking this up a notch, you can use a disaster recovery service. And the two main ones I've worked with are Azure Site Recovery and Zerto, who happens to be one of the sponsors of the summit. And the way these disaster recovery services work is you pay typically a fixed cost, which is around, I think they're priced similarly, around $25 per virtual machine. I think Zerto has a couple of options that have less functionality. But the fully functional one that's compatible with or similar to Azure Site Recovery is $25 a VM. And then you pay for the storage on the cloud. So you have effectively a synced copy of all of your VMs that are stored in the cloud. And when you bring them, when you fail over, you bring those online and you bring them synchronous into the cloud. This is, I say, $2 signs, and I also say 8 to 12 hours. The 8 to 12 hours here is mainly just to make sure everything's working. It does take some time to bring these machines online. It could be less. It's going to depend on the rate of change of your data. The other thing to keep in mind here is and we'll talk about it on the network, the next slide, but the network matters a lot there, because if you have a very busy set of VMs, you're going to need to have a pretty big network pipe to publish all those changes. But I really like this solution for most organizations because I think it's very simple to implement and provides a high degree of protection. Number 3 here is to have a full-time secondary warm site. You may also see number 4 is to have a full-time secondary hot site, and you may wonder what is the difference there. The main difference is what I consider to be a warm site in a cloud is where you, in order to save money, reduce the size of all of your compute resources so that your compute resources cost way less than your production resources. In the event of a disaster, you fail over, but you still have to resize everything. So that's one of the ways you can take advantage of the cloud. And you might not do this. You might mix a couple of these. So you might mix 2 and 3, whereas 3 would be what you do for your critical application, and 2 would be what you do for everything else. And then finally, 4 is just have a secondary full-time hot site. Main difference there, that hot site's going to have the same compute resources dedicated to it that your primary site's going to be. Those are pretty rare in the wild just because companies don't like to spend that much money. But I do see it with a couple of places. There's some challenges that are very specific to hybrid cloud. And I mentioned this in the last slide. It's really all about bandwidth. If you're pushing changes or even if you're pushing backups, your network really is the most important thing because that network connection to the cloud is kind of your lifeline. Also, if it's not adequate, you may run into a scenario where you lose more data than you otherwise might because you have data queuing waiting to get into that environment. So really understand the network connection you have between your cloud. If you're doing this on any sort of large scale, you're going to want to have a dedicated connection, like ExpressRoute from Azure or AWS Direct Connect to your cloud provider. One of the things you can potentially do, but I don't recommend, is owning your own redundant equipment in a second data center. I think there are a lot of benefits here to using cloud for DR. One of the things you want to do is make sure that your backup tools work well with your cloud vendor. We talked a little bit about that as well. And then finally, typically if you're hybrid cloud or just doing DR through the cloud, you might be a little bit more immature at working on the cloud. So it's important to kind of understand what the role-based access control security model that your organization is employing and how that looks in your environment. So testing. I talked about how it's so important to do DR testing. The cloud does really facilitate the ability to test these disaster recovery scenarios. If you're using Zerto or ASR, it's very easy to do this. You just press a few buttons. We've done some DR testing with customers. We've had the whole test complete in a matter of hours where we've been able to isolate the networks, not impact anything else in production, and just have a really good understanding of how your disaster recovery is going to work. And to me, this is something that I can't emphasize enough. So before we wrap up, one last slide that I wanted to put some thoughts in your head is the cloud really limitless? And this is a kind of a philosophical slide. And you'll see my quote, there is no cloud, it's just someone else's data center, which I think a lot of people have seen. But one of the things that can happen with, especially when something like Amazon East US 1 goes down, a lot of people are going to try to fail over to, Amazon US West. Because Amazon US West have enough spare capacity that it can take everyone failing over there or creating new resources there. If you're not in a situation where you have hot DR, that fully allocated DR environment, if there's a major disaster, either natural disaster or computer or cloud disaster, you might not be able to have to get enough cloud resources to bring your stuff online. This is a poorly understood edge case risk because the cloud providers are really kind of don't like to talk about capacity planning, even under NDAs. In my experience, they don't talk a whole lot about what capacity actually looks like. And so it's a poorly understood risk, but it is still a risk, and it's something you need to think about. So top tips for disaster recovery. What I like to say is it's all about the bandwidth and making sure you have enough bandwidth to get to your cloud environment. You need to understand your backup environment and what that means for cloud, like how that's going to work with the cloud. How can you access your backups in the cloud? Can you access those backups directly without having to go through the vendor tool? Or do you have to have a VM available for the vendor tool? Test. Always test those restores. If you can automate that stuff, all the better. And then finally, understand the needs of your business and build your solution to those needs. I've been way guilty of overbuilding HANDR solutions for my own edification, even though the company I was working for at the time didn't need it. I haven't done that since I've been a consultant, I promise. But when I had a real job, I was probably guilty of that. And with that, let's drop into the Q&A. And Chris, do we have any questions?
We do. Thanks for the great insight, Joey. Let's just jump right in. First question, how does bubble testing work?
Bubbly testing sounds much
Bubbly
better.
testing.
I may be doing that later tonight. Bubble testing is really kind of cool. So effectively what happens, and the reason why we call it bubble testing is because we have a completely isolated network, or as we would say, a bubble. This is typically going to be handled by software-defined networking. So if you're using VMware and you have something like VNX, you can probably do it on-prem yourself. But in the cloud, it's really easy to have multiple networks with the same IP spaces that can't talk to each other. For example, I built, one time I was building a training class for a bunch of students, and I built 20 environments in the same Azure subscription, and they all had the same IP address ranges. None of them were ever going to talk to each other, or could they? But the cloud allows you to do that. So you have this isolated environment where you can simply restore anything, bring stuff online without having to worry about it impacting anything else. The key thing there that you want to make sure you're good with is that you have all the dependent resources you need to bring your systems online, because you can bubble test, and if you're bubble testing like a subsection of some of your systems, if you don't have all the dependent resources, for example, a domain controller might be a kind of a classic example of this. If you don't have a domain controller there, you might not be able to authenticate, and things might not be able to work.
Okay, great. Here's a good question. What are the cloud costs involved in DR testing?
So it's pretty straightforward. You're basically paying for the compute you're using when you're running the test. In some cases, one of the kind of interesting cloud cost points that I always like to bring up is data coming into the cloud is almost always free. Data coming out of the cloud costs money. So if you're doing a DR test, you're doing it in the cloud, you're sending your backups there, you're not paying for any of that data until it gets written to a disk, at which point you're paying fairly cost-effective rates for that data to be stored on disk. But when you're actually doing the test, you pay for the compute. At least with Azure Site Recovery, and I believe with Zerto as well, there's a pretty one-click button where you say in test, and it just blows all of your compute resources away. So typically, if it takes you a day to do a test, you're maybe looking at, I've done some pretty big tests with a customer who's really mindful of their budget. And, we spend $1,000 or a couple of $1,000, and that's with allocating, hundreds of terabytes of storage and things like that. So a smaller scale test can cost less than $100 sometimes.
Looks like cost is definitely on the minds of our audience. Here's another one. Does cloud failover cost a lot?
That one is kind of an it depends question, but it depends on a number of factors, in really how much Going to the cloud, you can pretty much plan for, especially with VMs and storage. That's pretty easy. The pricing there is pretty fixed and not variable. Where it gets tricky is if you want to fail back. So if you have that DR and then you decide that you want to fail back, that's a trickier scenario in terms of cost.
Okay. Do you have a recommendation on how your network should be configured for a DR scenario?
That's the challenge there is just really, and there are some tools that like vendors like Zerto or Amazon or AWS or Azure will provide you for just measuring bandwidth. It's really, I think Azure has kind of a stock formula for ASR for the number of VMs you have, rate of change, and then you need this much bandwidth, and that's going to be what your network connection looks like. That's something that can be pretty expensive in terms of that network connection. And honestly, if you're doing that kind of DR, that network connection may be the most expensive part of your disaster recovery exercise.
Okay. Looks like Andrew got in a question right under the wire. What are the key points for my DR plan to make it portable between cloud providers? On AWS, decide to move to Azure, etc.
That's a really good question. You have a few options. The easiest and most expensive one is to use VMware on top of those clouds. That makes it extremely portable. Secondly, so one of the things that you're going to look at with moving between cloud providers is they make it possible to move between Amazon and Azure and Amazon and GCP, et cetera. They don't make it easy. So you can export your VMs, but you can't just fail them over. So you're typically going to be in the realm of looking at third-party solutions that are kind of going to do that process, but automate it and hopefully make it faster. So in that space, I think you're either looking at third-party solutions, or maybe if you can come up with another approach to DR where you're maybe not your method of DR isn't moving VMs between the cloud providers, it's moving data. That's definitely a trickier topic to address.
Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again for the talk, Joey.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day. Expert hands-on disaster recovery best practices for hybrid infrastructures. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by AvidPoint and Zerto, and we'll be right back.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors for today, AvidPoint and Zerto, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you all this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director, and I'm here to moderate the second session of our Hybrid Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Summit. This one's called Expert Hands-on Disaster Recovery Best Practices for Hybrid Infrastructures. Our speaker for this session is Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. I know your slide here says John O'Neill Sr. also, but he unfortunately couldn't make it, but Dave's here to save the day for us. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. Take it away, Dave.
Perfect. Thanks, Gladys, for having me, and once again, thanks for welcoming me to this amazing summit. Just a bit of housekeeping for our attendees that are listening in. When John and we do these sessions, we like to do these as interactive as possible. So even although my dear friend John will be here today, I'm here to help, and I would love to take your questions throughout the presentation. So if there's any burning topics that are coming up, as we're going through and discussing some of these best practices for your hybrid infrastructure, feel free, fire away. I will be checking the Q&A panel as we go. All right, let's get right to the gold nuggets. Why you're here attending the session today is because you want the right information right now. And whenever we talk about disaster recovery, disaster preparedness, or hybrid infrastructure, the new world that we live in today, not the traditional fire, flood, power outages, wicked snowstorms taking out our infrastructure that I'm concerned about anymore. It's about the bad guys actively targeting our infrastructure. And so where I'm going to lead off with today's presentation is just a little story that I have for you. A little bit of background. I've been a part, unfortunately, of over 12 ransomware recovery teams helping organizations either through small-scale ransomware attacks or even full-on, end-of-days type ransomware attacks where the bad guys got admin-level access and went through and started wiping out key infrastructure. So I have a lot of experience in this realm of disaster recovery, especially when it comes to cyber disaster recovery. And the first thing that you have to walk away from this summit is a single word that hopefully resonates with you. And it's a word that's been around for a while in the technology sectors. I'm kind of the old guy now. I've been around for 25 plus years doing this. And, back in the day, we used to have tape backups. And when we wanted to protect those tapes, there was a little tab on the tape that you could break off, making it so that it was read-only. And so those types of platforms were called write once, read many. And in today's world, we call this immutability. So synthetically, when we look at our backups or DR replicas that are going to our infrastructure, we want to make sure that if we do have some type of compromise inside of our infrastructure, that the data is hardened and it can't be changed. So when I think about immutability in today's world, it's, I want to write my copies of my backup data somewhere, and I want to make sure that it can't be changed for a period of time. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that a lot of the backup vendors that are out there today are supporting immutability options for their storage backup targets, which is great. And so, where this first started for us was, AWS had some great solutions for immutable storage options with S3. I know Microsoft's getting there, but the big thing is that we want to make sure that your data is protected, because in the event that you have a breach, in the event the bad guy gets access into your infrastructure, we need to have the ability to recover from one of these repositories. All right. And so it's important now that you look at not only your backup repositories being immutable on-prem, you also have to make sure that you look at those options in the cloud as well. The second thing is I see a lot of organizations when they're building these backup targets, for lack of better terms, it's quite easy to build a Windows-based backup target. It's just a storage server. So I'll see organizations build these things out and next finish the install, thinking that, oh well, it's just backup infrastructure. It doesn't have to fall under the same criteria as my production storage targets. The opposite is, couldn't be more true here, where we want to take and we want to make sure that we, if not harden those backup targets with security policies, group policies, lock them down, make sure we've got vulnerability assessments that we run against them, make sure that we've got multi-factor authentication to access them. We want to make sure that those are buttoned up and that they're incredibly secure. The next thing for your organization, you have to not think about if you're going to be hit. And I know it's a virtual summit, so normally if I was presenting in person, I'd ask for a show of hands on this question. How many of you have been hit by some type of a cyber attack or ransomware attack in the last 24 months? And reluctantly, your hands are kind of virtually going up right now. And the reality is this is now probably more than 60+% of organizations today. And so one of the things I really recommend is, even beyond immutability, is having dark and offline copies of your most critical data. Because when we look at recoverability from some type of a cyber event that takes place, it's not as simple as just being able to recover the data. Having the data is great. Having it on an immutable backup or replica target is great. I can't press the big red button to just reset the world for you, because there's a fundamental problem that we have to deal with first. And that's the bad guy. It's still in your infrastructure. I can't do anything until I get them out. I can't do anything until your cyber insurance vendor has done some type of a forensic analysis. I've seen this take up to 2 weeks. My infrastructure teams are kicked out of the infrastructure for 2 weeks while the cyber teams are trying to figure out exactly where the attack came from. And I'll tell you why that's important, because it's absolutely imperative that we ensure that those bad guys aren't still in there. Because the moment that we go to restore that data, then that could trigger a cascading effect where, the bad guys are detecting that we're trying to restore the data, and now maybe either A, the ransom goes up, or B, they start releasing your data in a kind of a ransomware-less attack where they're just going to start selling your data on the dark web. And so that's huge. And having those dark offline copies would potentially allow me, in the event that even your backup targets got taken out, I have that lockbox. Think of a tape that's been sent off to a service provider back in the day like Iron Mountain. I have a dark copy of that data, because typically what ends up happening is we have to start building parallel infrastructure during one of these attacks, and we have to start rebuilding side by side. We can't just light everything up. So kind of your first tip here is immutability. If you're not looking at this, you need to be looking at this as kind of your number one top priority for DR and backup for your hybrid infrastructure. Okay, so let's assume that we've followed step one. And in following step one, we've taken and, we've built those immutable backup targets. We feel pretty comfortable that we've hardened that infrastructure, and we want to take and, pass our audit controls. Well, one of the things that's important with DR, especially modern DR, is that we have what's called a run book or playbook. And this is, listing out and mapping out all of the steps required that are going to take us through that DR process. And that run book is absolutely pointless unless you validate it. And so how does that validation occur? Well, traditionally, what would be involved is an annual or biannual DR test for most organizations. And I'm telling you right now, an annual or biannual test is not enough anymore. You need to be going through a consistent testing and validation process to make sure that everything is working properly. And so this can actually be automated. So you want to automate that wherever possible. Try to automate the documentation, map out your recovery times and your recovery point objectives with the business. And that's really key, is you need to make sure that this part of the process is not solely driven by IT. There's kind of a bit of a marriage that occurs between the IT teams and the business, especially when it comes to disaster recovery, business continuity planning. Us in IT, we can't define the standards that the business requires for their most critical applications. We have to communicate with the business. We have to get the business involved. We have to get executive sponsorship, and we have to have a clear level of understanding between both sides of kind of what's possible. Because at the end of the day, the business might come back and say, well, we can't afford to lose any time. We want to have zero data loss. And so we come back as IT and say, okay, that's fine. anything's possible in today's world, but I don't think you're going to really like the price tag that comes along with a seamless solution like that. So then we have a bit of a reality check. We come back to the table and we say, okay, yeah, you know what? 4 to 8 hours is probably acceptable. And so as we go through that, passing any of your new modern audits, one of the requisite requirements inside of there is proving that you can actually meet those RTOs and RPOs for whatever your plan is defining, and be very realistic about it. Don't make everything a gold tier service. There's certain infrastructure that is required to really run the business. There's other infrastructure that you can potentially live without for a couple of days. You can go back to a manual process. I do a lot of work in the manufacturing sector today, and one of the things in the manufacturing sector is we have to take and we have to affix serial numbers or labels or things like that to the parts that are produced inside of the manufacturing facilities. Well, if we know that there's going to be a planned outage, a sustained outage for a point in time, we can actually go ahead and pre-print and keep that plant operating, going back to a manual process for a period of time if we know and we're aware that something is going to happen. So in a planned DR scenario, giving the business as much time and notice as possible is really key, because now there could be the difference of me, keeping that plant operating for the 24 hours where potentially we're going to have to take an outage for some reason. Maybe core power is coming back into, the facility and we're going to have to take some things out. Is a multitude of reasons behind that. All right. But the big thing is make sure that we're taking and having a high level of communication with the business around this so that everybody is informed. One of the things that I recommend is that you start having monthly DR meetings with your executive teams so that they are completely aware of, what's happening. If there's any gaps, if there's any issues, those need to be addressed, so be it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what real DR looks like, especially for hybrid infrastructure as we go on through this presentation. But that communication bridge between IT and the business is just so important here. And the last thing is, and I always tell everyone this, your backups are absolutely useless if you're not going to test and validate those. And you should have a process for testing and validating those, because the moment that you have a declared emergency, and once again, I'm going to ask for the virtual show of hands for everybody that's listening here. And if you're at the office, or if you're at home, it's not going to seem it's funny, but if you're at the office and you're raising your hand to your computer, people are going to probably walk by and think it's funny. So I helped give everybody a laugh at the office here today. But how many of you have had to go through a real DR process where, management's breathing down your neck and saying, listen, when is this going to be back online? We really need to get this back up and running and operational. And we have to come back as IT and say, well, I hate to break this to you, but you should probably send everybody home, or you should probably give people the day off work because they're not coming back to work today, because we're not going to be able to get, that critical sales application back up and running, because in our automated and DR testing validation business continuity plans, the accounting systems are actually slot ranking as more important, and not to say that one individual inside the organization or one entity inside the organization is more important than the others, but you have to prioritize that in the level of recovery. And so everybody is going to want their stuff back right now, and you have to be able to fend off the business. So I know it's not listed on the slide, but one of the other little gold nuggets for number 2 is inside of IT, somebody inside of a senior leadership role should be allocated the responsibility of being kind of the deflector shield for the business during a DR event, because our core IT resources are really smart individuals that are bringing back this infrastructure for us. They need to kind of be left alone for a period of time just so that they can figure out what's going on and they can get your infrastructure back up. So you need to be able to deflect a bunch of what's coming down from the business. Getting pulled into meetings every 5 minutes is just going to mean it's going to take longer to get back. And so I would highly recommend allocating somebody in that senior leadership role to taking on that responsibility of deflecting a lot of those questions from the business and working with them to make sure they have a clear and concise understanding. But that should be a dedicated role inside of your DR plans. And leading into that, your DR runbooks. So now you've got a scenario where it's that one Monday morning. Something has happened. It could potentially be a scenario of your traditional DR, your fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, snowstorm, power outage, forest fire, power grid failure. Everyone turned on their air conditioners and took out the power grid. Everyone started charging their Teslas and took out the power grid. These are all new things that we have to think about now. And so that traditional DR is one that I think that we're fairly well versed in from a DR and planning perspective for most organizations. We've got a pretty good understanding of how to handle that. And it's a lot of speeds and feeds and things like that. And it's going to be, okay, is it a single facility failure? So I kind of classify this into 3 categories, DR1, DR2, DR3. DR1 is a single rack failure, and the rest of that room or the rest of that kind of cabinet or the rest of that spot in the co-location facility are fine, and I can just fail over to another rack that's side by side. So for me, that's DR1. It's very proximity-wise within hundreds of feet. It's very close. And so in a lot of cases, I'll set up a DR1 for my most critical applications. That way I don't have to fail over to another facility. I can simply just have a highly available failover where I maintain the same IP space, and it's a very easy failover. Okay? DR2 would be that something is wrong inside of that facility. So I want to take and either fail over to another spot on the campus, because a lot of these organizations are very large. They could have 2 data centers spread at either side of the campus. So now maybe instead of being DR1 in the same room, maybe I can fail over somewhere on the same campus. Maybe I don't need to make routing changes or IP changes still, but there's DR2. And then DR3 is where we actually have to fail over to another facility, cloud provider, something like that. So I'm physically off-prem, off-network. And I've got to deal with potentially some routing and some IP issues as I go to move that over. And so that DR1, 2, 3 scenario is something that, like I said, I feel that most organizations have a pretty good handle on. Where the game has changed for your run books and how you have to behave in that event of DR, and I'll give you another little story here. Okay, it's July of 2021, and I get a phone call from a friend of mine. And this friend of mine is the president of a very large managed service provider. And he starts off and he's like, "Hey, Dave, I hate to call you on, I think it was a Sunday, but, have you seen the news?" So first of all, when somebody like that calls you and they say, "Have you seen the news?" It's normally an interesting conversation. And I said, "No, I don't typically watch the news on the weekends. I like to go dirt biking and do other things and try not to turn on my TV." And he's like, "Listen, the biggest ransomware event in the history of the world has just occurred here. And this was the Kaseya breach." And so, what ended up happening with that was, anybody that used that MSP tool, there was agents that were installed on everything that software was managing. And the bad guys figured out a way to get in, cloud-wise, get access. And this particular MSP, over 80 customers, instantly whole-level, system-level access, beyond God-level access onto everything, got ransomwared at the same time. 80, not systems, customers. And wow, And so, yeah, so I got brought in, and that was one of the big jobs I had to work on last year. But it was a big eye-opener because, when we take a look at the run books for that, there really wasn't, prior to a couple of years ago, run books that classified cyber attacks and cyber threats and ransomware and hacking and extortion as a potential, DR event for us. Not until this started running rampant. And, where this really, really started to run rampant that I've seen was at the beginning of COVID-19. We were told, send everybody home, get everybody VPN access, we'll deal with security later. And now I have 1 billion endpoints on individuals' home networks that have never been secured properly on wide open VPNs because we didn't have time to get everything locked down. Well, let me tell you, that was a lot of low-hanging fruit for the bad guys, and we're still paying for it now. We're still cleaning up the mess. And so cyber DR is very different. And so those of you that have been involved in a cyber DR event, and you have a cyber insurance policy, if you flip to the middle of your policy, there's going to be a section inside of there that's going to say, in the event of attack, call this number. Email, attack compromise at blah, blah, blah insurance company. And it's kind of like your bat phone that you have. It's a big red phone that lives in your data center. Pick this up in event of emergency. And it's a pretty interesting scenario because what you're paying for inside of that insurance policy when you have an event like that is the cyber insurance provider will contact their series of forensic analysts to start helping you understand and locking things down. So, the very first thing they're going to do is they're going to say, well, do you have any advanced persistent threat detection on all of your infrastructure? And if you do, we're going to need to see it. If you don't, here's some agents that you need to use from, provider of your choice. And we need to get visibility to see what's happening in the infrastructure because we need to see potentially where a command and control server is going to be living. We need to see where these connections are being established, and we need to be able to synthetically start shutting this stuff down. And we'll go for a period of just kind of watching to see what's going on. And that's a big one, okay? And the big piece of advice is that I have for you guys is that if you think that you're under some type of a cyber or cyber DR attack, start shutting stuff down because the longer that you leave it on the network, the worse it's potentially going to get. And you think to yourself, wow, like, what are you talking about? Just go start pulling the pin and start, pulling the power on servers and firewalls and everything else. That's actually exactly what I'm talking about because I've seen situations before where the threat actors played a nasty little trick on our IT team. They got in, they had admin level access, and they thought it would be super fun to put scheduled tasks inside of our servers where the moment that anyone would log on, you could have 30 seconds and then you'd see a little message pop up and then you'd watch all your data get Pac-Maned on that server. And it was gone. And so the more you start logging in and checking things, you could actually be doing more damage. But this is something you have to play out inside of that plan because, like I said, cyber DR is different from traditional DR, and you have to first try to determine how bad it is, how far it's spread. But we are of the mentality now to start shutting stuff down. If you have the ability with software on your network where you can use network controls to start disabling systems, do what you can. It's a salvage operation once they're in. And the other thing is that there's new types of malware that are out there that aren't even looking for a ransom anymore. They're just trying to go through and actively destroy infrastructure. So if that type of malware is in there and it's actively trying to destroy your infrastructure, and I'll close off this slide here on one point. The cyber insurance vendor that we worked with on that Kaseya breach shared with us some of the control files that were being used from the Revel ransomware strain, which is what we were dealing with. And there was an ini file inside of there, and inside of that had a bunch of parameters. And some of the parameters were hunt for backup services from your most popular backup vendors. Okay, fantastic. Hunt for the word backup inside of folders. So if you have a storage target that's not immutable, and you stored all your backups in a folder called backups, it said shift delete all of that. Just go kill it. If there's anything with the word backup, just go ahead and kill it. And so the bad guys actively target your DR infrastructure because it's a way for you to be able to recover. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't just press the big red button to fail back or fail over, because you have to get them out of your infrastructure first, okay? So it's not simple. The cyber DR thing is something that you really need to think about, because it's one of those areas that, don't wait until you're hit. You have to start planning for this now. And then go through modeling exercises with, red team, blue team. I've even introduced a new one for a cloud team, and start modeling, what these threats are going to look like. And, I tell you, it's a lot easier to have these conversations with the business now than what it was 5 years ago, because almost every executive that's out there has a buddy that works for some company that's been hit hard by ransomware. So if you don't think that this is hitting close to home for them, it absolutely is. And if unfortunately you're listening to this presentation and you have had to go through one of these scenarios, boy, wouldn't have you liked to have had a cyber DR guide that helps you deal with making those right decisions, because the level of panic and onset that comes with this is absolutely incredible for these organizations. And then the other hidden intangible that happens when you go through these cyber DR exercises is the amount of IT burnout that I've seen from running your teams to the max. It's huge. I've seen this absolutely crush teams for 6+ months, where, you get so burned out that you can't really do much more after that, because you just ran for a month and a half straight just trying to get the business back up and operational. So it has a long-term impact, and that should also be something that's built in to your cyber DR plan. Okay, so the next one here is just a traditional backup rule, and this plays true regardless of who your backup vendors are. The 3-2-1 rule, 3 copies of your data on 2 different storage media and 1 offsite. That was the old rule that we had with 3-2-1. Why did you want that? Why did you want 3 copies of your data? Well, first of all, 1 copy is primary. That's where your actual production data lives. 2 copies of your data, because what good is a backup target if the RAID array gets roasted and I don't have any of those backups anymore? So you want to make sure that your backup data is stored at least twice, because I've seen on more than one occasion we go to restore and there's corruption issues on the primary backup target, and it's irrecoverable. As far as the backup vendor is concerned, they wash their hands of it, saying, listen, we check that data as best we can, but if your RAID array went and roasted everything, that's not really our problem. You want to make sure that one of those copies of that data is off-site, because if that facility actually has fire or something like that, or flood, and that data is destroyed, it's useless to you. So you need to make sure that one of those is off-site. You now want to make sure that one of those is offline/immutable. And now the 0 is make sure that you're verifying all of those backups to make sure that they're actually functional. Because once again, what's the point in having backups if you're not testing them? Okay, this is going to be a new one for everyone, number 5, more than likely. You're going to understand this, but I've kind of put a term to this. And so based on that 3-2-1 rule that we just learned about, we want to have multiple copies of our data. And this is something that we don't always often think about inside of IT. We always think about, well, yeah, of course I can add an extra 100 gigs or an extra terabyte to that server or an extra 10 terabyte storage volume. No problem. You can just store data at will. There's no consequences to this. Well, when we live in a world now where, we're running with modern hyper-converged infrastructure for most of our production workloads, most organizations have some type of form of hyperconvergence. With that form of hyperconvergence comes a lot of all-flash arrays. Those things are running really fast. So I find that we're getting a little smarter as to how much data we're putting on those, because it's a little more expensive than what it used to be, going through and putting that data there. It's faster, but it's not free. But let's take the example of that service request coming in. can you please take the accounting server and I need to extend the data drive by 100 gigs? And you're like, yep, sure. It's actually technically not that hard to do. Couple clicks, couple PowerShell commands, whatever your hypervisor is. It's not hard to extend that, okay? But this is what ends up happening, is that now that 100 gigs of data has 100 gigs as a primary copy, okay? So that 100 gigs has a primary copy. Then we want to keep 2 copies of that from a backup perspective. So now we're up to 200 and 300 gigs of data instead of just 100. I want to keep 1 copy of that offsite, sorry. So that could be part of that 300. Now I want to keep 1 offline, so now I'm up to 400. So quickly I'm up to 400 to 500. Now that's just backup data. What about your DR replica data? So now I might want to be having DR replica copies of that. If I decide to run with a DR 123 scenario, I could be up to 600, 700, 800 gigs real quick for that 100 gigs of storage. And so I call this the cascade effect, because that small change has deep and reaching impact inside of your infrastructure. A small change like adding 100 gigs is actually quite a big deal for the backup and DR team, because our backup and DR teams now have to deal with storing that data multiple times on multiple different storage mediums, maybe on hardened and immutable repositories, maybe across multiple cloud providers. Maybe I have to worry about the uploads of all of that data to the cloud because I'm syncing there, and it becomes a big deal. And 100 gigs is nothing for your infrastructure. We're talking, in most organizations, this is tens, if not hundreds of terabytes of data, maybe even petabytes of data. And so if that's the case, this 3-2-1 rule and the cascade effect are huge, okay? And in reverse, one of the things I want you to think about with the cascade effect is you can gain back a lot of that space. You can gain back a lot of that space by the reverse cascade effect. Don't be scared to go through and clean up your old VMs that are in the infrastructure. Because if you start leaving old VMs inside of your infrastructure, your hybrid infrastructure that you're running, you are wasting space on all of those backup targets, okay, on all of those replica targets that you have out there, on all of your infrastructure. Yes, I understand that there could be space savings and space gains from, inline deduplication or post-process deduplication. That's traditionally how we would deal with those gobs of space that we have. But at the end of the day, when it comes time for me to take and recall that data, I have to at some point in time rehydrate that data to now bring it back. And so that starts to become rather problematic for me. Okay, because there's going to be a penalty at some point in time if we're going to start deduping that data. So for me, in my mind, when I'm planning this, I never really plan inside of using with dedupe. I always use just the fixed data costs, right? So I know that dedupe can provide some savings, but this is one of those areas that you can really take this away and take a good hard look at your infrastructure. And with your infrastructure, you can take a look at gaining a lot of savings by taking and simply not being a data hoarder. If you can delete things, don't be scared to delete old things inside of your infrastructure. Okay, in the last session, there's some great topics that were being discussed around recovery to the cloud. And recovery to the cloud, especially with hybrid infrastructure, it really has a lot of benefits in today's modern world that we live. And one of the big things is scalability and performance in the cloud versus scalability inside of your own hybrid infrastructure. The cloud is going to be able to scale further. You've got multiple regions, multiple countries. We can synthetically move data around between, data centers. And so the big thing is that, inside of those DR plans, maybe consider a cloud recovery strategy. Remember that I consider this like a DR3 option. So if DR3 is where we need to go for whatever reason, maybe that one Monday morning happened to all of you, and you guys have an issue where the ransomware attack hit. The hackers or the bad guys got in, and you want to start rebuilding some greenfield infrastructure. Your on-prem infrastructure is potentially compromised. You had a hardened, immutable copy of that data living up in the cloud already. So what we have to think about is that, do we really have the time at this present juncture to move all of those terabytes or petabytes of data back on-prem to perform a recovery, or are we better off to just now say, we're going to fail over to the cloud, and maybe we're going to go through a resynchronization process to bring the data back on-prem, but at least we can get back up and running in the cloud. Yes, I understand that there's costs to running in the cloud. There's also costs to running on-prem, but it's a matter of getting the business back up and running. And because the data already exists in the cloud, because we were backing it up there, the recovery time to restore in the cloud is going to be a lot faster, okay? Now, I've been getting asked this question a lot with, customers that are looking at, DR to the cloud, but they're not using DR for primary and production workloads right now. They've basically just spun up some type of like an Azure tenant or something like that, and that's where they're recovering to. So they've got a copy of their data that's up there, and they can press the big red button and they can fail over. Maybe they've got an express route or networking pass or VPN or whatever, so that they have the ability to do failover and fail back from the cloud. But the data lives there. But the question that I often ask them is, I'm like, did you just go through like a next finish on your tenant? Like, did you just throw your credit card in there, and did you get a portal? Because that's pretty much equivalent for me of a next finish server build. There are so many things that need to be locked down and hardened inside of those tenants that you may or may not be aware of. Microsoft is helping you with this by creating what are called Azure blueprints, which are definitions, policy definitions, and security definitions that will take and help you harden that tenant. So if you are building this greenfield or you do want to lock that down, you can at least evaluate those settings that are in there. And it's often the things that you don't know about that are kind of the most problematic for you. And those things that you don't know about can be handled by advanced threat protection AI solutions like Microsoft's Defender Cloud. It'll holistically look at anything that you've configured inside of your tenant, and it will give you security recommendations, remediations, and real-time vulnerability assessments on anything that you're putting up there. So you can make sure that where you're putting that data is secure, because like I said, at the end of the day, maybe you're failing it over there because you just suffered an on-prem breach. Well, you don't want to have a cloud breach right afterwards that's going to come in right behind and wipe out all of your VR gear, okay? So recovery of the cloud, yes, I think it's a really good idea. Yes, you do have to plan for it and make sure that you harden those tenants. Okay, the next one for us is dealing with notes from the field, okay? So let's take a look at a non-ransomware recovery event, just a traditional DR event. We know that we're having some type of a telco maintenance issue in facility one, or maybe we have an issue where one Monday morning, the primary fiber optic connections into our data center in building one go down. That building is dead to the world. There's no real ETA on fixing it, and we need to get back up and running. Well, good news, we had replicas from like 4 hours ago. We're still within our service window to the business. We've got no option to do a planned failover because the fiber's already been cut, so we're going to use a failover now option inside of our tooling. So we say failover now, and the tickets are already rolling in. And, we fail over to our DR gear. But the problem was, and you tell me once again by a virtual show of hands, how many of you on the call today rehab your old infrastructure and use it for DR infrastructure, saying, Oh, you know what? That HP DL380 G8 or G9 server still has 512 gigs of RAM in it. And, yeah, it's got spinning disk and it's not flash, but, it ran the business for all these years. And so it should still be fine for DR. So we're going to throw, we'll throw these Frankenstein concoctions together to build up DR. And now all of a sudden you're in a real DR event and the tickets are really rolling in. Why? Because when you went to go light up the VMs on that other side, you're hitting a storage I/O storm because you just tried to turn on, 40 or 50 VMs at once on a single host or into a cluster. Never really stress tested it before, but now we've got users all trying to get in and do their jobs at the same time because everything's backlogged, and maybe it's timesheet day, maybe it's day before payroll, maybe it's month end, whatever it is. The systems are being hit really hard. Speeds are unacceptable now. We're seeing delay times of just trying to open files on the network of 5 minutes. So from a DR perspective, were you able to fail over to DR? And the short answer is yes. I checked the checkbox that said I can fail over to DR, but is it performant? And by performant, I mean, is it some resemblance, some way, shape, or form of production? Because the moment that you have to press that big red button and your DR infrastructure can't keep up, why did you even do it in the first place? You just basically had a parking spot for data. That's almost like just a backup copy of data. It's not replicas of VM. I can only turn on half of the VMs. I can only get half of the infrastructure up and running. And so my point to this is that, and it's to my question there, is DR production? Is DR production the same as production is production? And in my mind, when you walk through this particular scenario, or you've had to walk a mile in my shoes and had to deal with angry executives, and they come to us and they say, well, I know we didn't want to spend the money on DR and we understood your request, but you didn't really explain how slow this would be. And if you would have explained to us how slow this would have been, then we would have made some different financial decisions. So don't let it get to that point. You need to sell this properly at the beginning of your project. Get yourself some real gear for DR. Treat DR as much as production is. Yes, I understand that there's going to be some cycles and some wasted RAM chips because hopefully that data just sits over there dormant and you never have to press that big red button. It's going to become very, very problematic for you when you can't run all of your infrastructure. So is DR production? The short answer is yes, absolutely. DR is just as much production as production is. Okay, 3 more here and then we'll take a few questions. The next thing is for your DR projects, supply chain constraints. So now you just went through that scenario where you went to go fail over to DR. The business just bought in and they said, okay, you got us. We understand that, we need to order some of this production gear now for our disaster recovery site, for our hybrid infrastructure. Go ahead, order yourself another HCI cluster. You've got CapEx approval to do it. And then you come back to the business and you say, okay, the ship date is going to be sometime in October of 2022, hopefully. And the switches that we need are going to be November. And these are actual cases. We had a switch order that just came in a month ago at a customer for gear from your favorite switching provider that was over 13 months sitting in a PO, and it finally just dropped because of chip shortages. Okay, the supply chain constraints are absolutely real, and just because you think that you're going to be able to go get hardware, you may not even be able to go get hardware. So now go back a couple slides. Maybe DR to the cloud is sounding a lot more reasonable for you because you're not even able to get gear anymore because it's just not coming in fast enough. I have customers now that are buying and they're preparing for supply chain type issues, But they're like, we can't shut our plant down. Let's say that there's a flood in the server room or something unforeseen happens and takes out our primary gear. I can't wait 9 months to get new gear to turn my plant back on. I need new gear tomorrow. So they're actually pre-ordering complete kit build spares, HCI clusters, leaving them in the boxes and leaving them A, at a different facility, and B, just leaving them there as spares. Because, yes, we understand there's a cost, but what's the cost of shutting down your plant for 9 months while you wait for infrastructure? That's not going to fly either. So I have customers that are doing that now. And maybe in that situation, maybe that plant can't run cloud-based. Maybe it has to be on-prem. So just be aware of that organizations are doing that. I know in the previous session we said that, we're not big fans of pre-ordering hardware and stuff like that. But in these supply chain constraints, this world that we live in, I highly endorse that. Get spare drives, get memory, get chassis, get that stuff on order, because if you have hardware failures, you're going to have some big shocks on your when you realize that it's going to take up to 9 months to get spare parts in. Okay, I can't say enough about training. Training is evolving for most organizations, especially the DR team. That traditional fire, flood, DR run book one is one thing, but you need to train your teams on cyber DR and what that means to them. You need to train the business on what DR is. You need to train the business and give them visibility so that they can understand what it means to be down, what it means to be slow, what it means to have unusable systems, okay? It's not just working with them with the business continuity plans. It's working with them holistically on all of this together. And my biggest piece of advice as you go to train the business is be transparent with them. Let them know exactly what they're dealing with, because when it hits the fan and there's problems and everybody's mad because things are offline, at least there was a path of communication that kind of, I'll use the word vindicates IT, from, them coming back and saying, we didn't know what we were doing. No, we understood what this was, and, the business choose to accept those risks, and that's what we have to deal with. And then through that training process, start doing your DR tests and training and making sure that everybody understands this, because these cyber threats that we face today are not getting any better. They're only getting worse. So training is huge, all right? And then the last thing is, I'll leave off with where your DR infrastructure should live. We in IT are kind of victims of a story that we've told for years. And part of the story was, from an identity perspective, it's so difficult to manage identity in all of these different Active Directory domains. We should consolidate to a single domain. A single domain is where we really want to be. We'll just implement security inside of a single domain. Well, as it turns out, in the world that we live in, that actually made it a lot easier for hackers to laterally spread through all of our infrastructure, especially for organizations that hadn't implemented a zero trust model. And what we recommend today to anyone that we talk to is you want to build a fabric. And simply put, what is a fabric? A fabric is a separate Active Directory domain, minimum of 2 domain controllers. You want to lock it down. You want to implement the, for example, Center for Internet Security, security baselines and policies. Microsoft has their own through the Security Compliance Toolkit. Make sure that you lock that down. Don't just next finish those installs. Lock them down. Make sure that they can pass the real-time vulnerability assessments provided by your operating system vendors or other security vendors that are out there, whomever you trust. Make sure that you're passing all of those vulnerability assessments and button up all of your backup and DR infrastructure. The reason that you want to do this is in the event that you have a domain admin level compromise or local admin level compromise inside of your organization, and they decide that they're going to go ransom everything. Now that all your hypervisors and backup targets live in a separate attack plane, a separate forest we'll call fabric, now we have the potential of restoring that infrastructure for you. So we could actually rewind all that to tomorrow or to yesterday if we had to, because they haven't gotten access to the fabric. Fabric is highly constrained, multi-factor authentication, privileged access workstations, as tight as you can make it. That's how you make the fabric. And the last piece that I'll leave off with before we get to a couple questions here is zero trust. Zero trust, I find organizations make this way more complicated than it needs to be. By default, this is how it works. If you next finish an Active Directory domain, by default, the domain administrators group and any members of that group are local administrators on any member servers and any workstations that you have in that domain. It is the elevated account. Did you know that a domain administrator is only required to be able to log on to one thing in Active Directory, and that's a domain controller? So domain admins, you leave reserved for your domain controllers. Create a new group, and you remove domain administrators from local logon from everything else. Create a new group called server admins. Server admins can log into servers. Workstation admins can log into workstations. Implement your lapse policies from Microsoft, your local admin password solution. It's actually not that hard to put in place. Randomizes those passwords across all of those workstations and servers for the local admin accounts so that the bad guy can't just hack into one thing and quickly move laterally across, okay? And so this is really important from your hybrid infrastructure and your DR and protecting this and future-proofing, all right? So kind of with that, I got a couple questions that we'll take here. And the first question that we have coming in is, what was the longest delay for ordering hardware that you've seen to date? And I would have to say right now, I ordered some switches for a customer. I talked about the 13-month delay. I'm into like the 16-month delay ETA on getting these switches for a customer. And they're not even like super high-end switches. These are just like 10 gig switches that we've got on order for the customer. It's borderline pretty ridiculous right now, but it's something that we've definitely seen, right? All right, another question here. Do you recommend running separate physical hardware to power a fabric? I would recommend that you have some separate hypervisors that are dedicated to run your domain controllers and key infrastructure for the fabric. It doesn't have to be like super powerful, and you don't actually need a lot of space to run your fabric. Your fabric, it's probably, in all honesty, you run the whole fabric in less than 300 gigs of space, probably, maybe even less than that, depending on if you want to put fabric domain controllers out to your different sites, because you're running basically 2 Active Directory deployments, but a domain controller doesn't really take up that much space. It's just really an authentication realm that we have. So, yeah, I would probably recommend that you have a bit of separate hardware for your fabric, especially in your hybrid infrastructure. Cost to it, but if it makes it more secure, then, that's great. And one more question here, and then we'll wrap up. And this one here is, with the supply chain issues present today, is it a good idea to accelerate projects? Oh, this is actually a really good question. For example, we have a 5-year life cycle on our hardware. Should we shorten the procurement process to 4 years to deal with the limitations of supply chain and delays? Wow, that is actually a really good question. I hadn't thought about changing the life cycle for these organizations, but I guess we kind of have to now. Like even I thought a 60-month plan with 5 years was pretty aggressive, but I kind of concur with that sentiment that, we're looking at something where if we're talking a year to get gear in, you maybe not implement it all, but at least get it ordered at that 48-month period. So, no, I think that's really great. So, so one last question is, and this one here is from Steve, great question. I have read from some security experts that there's such a thing called zero trust. What are your thoughts on this? And so, Steve, great question. That was to my previous slide. Zero trust is where we're going to take that concept of shifting the responsibility of like what a domain administrator can do and really limit the roles of that, kind of build bubbles around it. So a domain admin can only log into domain controllers. A server admin can only log into servers. A SQL admin can only manage SQL servers and stuff like that. Taking that to the next level and just leaving this off, you guys really want to investigate privileged identity management, where we can give just-in-time access for a period of time with a full approval chain. And with that, I'll hand it back to our wonderful moderators. Thank you, everyone, very much for attending my session today. I hope you really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was a really informative session.